So, there's this Japanese soldier who kept fighting for 30 years after World War II had actually ended. Japan was fighting against America and the Allied forces, and even though everyone tried to convince him that the war had been over for years, he stayed stubborn, fully convinced that his country hadn't been defeated. He believed it was impossible for them to lose as long as the Japanese emperor himself hadn't announced a surrender. Our hero today is named Onoda. When he was 20, he joined a military school in Japan and was specifically trained in guerrilla warfare, a type of fighting that isn't normal or traditional. There's no face-to-face combat, it's all about stealthy, surprise, and random attacks. Soldiers trained this way usually fight behind enemy lines, hiding in mountains or forests and launching sudden ambushes. Back in 1944, when the war was in full swing, Japan was America's enemy. America had taken control of a Philippine island called Lubang and was using it as a military base. The Japanese army decided to send a group of soldiers trained in guerrilla warfare to that island, and Onoda was one of them. The commanding officer gave them very clear orders. He told them, "It's forbidden for you to surrender. It might take 2 years or even 5, but no matter what happens, we will come back for you. Until then, even if there's only one soldier left, you must keep the mission going. You might not find anything to eat but coconuts, in that case, live on coconuts. It's forbidden for you to surrender your life voluntarily under any circumstances." They originally had a plan to sabotage the island's ports to stop enemy reinforcements, but the higher-ranking officers didn't like that idea. They thought it was too risky because the ports were heavily guarded by a large number of enemy soldiers, so they decided against it and focused on less risky sabotage instead. They started attacking farms, supply depots, and sometimes cars or groups of soldiers wandering away from their camps. The problem for the Americans was that this group kept messing with their supply lines. Actually, supplies did get through via the ports Onoda had suggested blowing up. Because they didn't listen to him. And because of the supplies the enemies were getting, the Japanese battalion had to split into small groups of 4. They started moving through the forests and mountains on the island. Because they were split up against massive enemy forces, the Japanese group started falling one after another, until only a few were left. One of those remaining groups was Onoda's. He had 3 soldiers with him, Akatsu, Shimoda, and Kozuka. The 4 of them lived together in the forest, eating bananas and coconuts. They would occasionally raid local farms to steal livestock and whatever they could find. To them, this was justified because they were in a state of war, and the Filipinos were American allies. About a year went by, and they were still in the same situation. They had no idea that their home country was struggling through the war and that the Allies, led by America and the Soviet Union, were wearing down the Japanese Empire. In 1945, America delivered its knockout blow by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After that brutal strike with a devastating nuclear weapon. Something the Japanese hadn't accounted for, the Japanese emperor decided to announce Japan's defeat and surrender. He knew it was the only way to save his people, or else America might have wiped Japan off the map with its destructive nuclear weapons, the likes of which the world had never seen before. The Japanese Empire announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, which ended World War II. But on the Philippine island of Lubang, large groups of Japanese soldiers who were hiding in the forests and mountains didn't have a clue what was happening in the world. They had no news about the war ending. The only thing they knew were the orders they'd been given: don't surrender, don't kill yourselves, and wait for support. These orders were absolute for them. Onoda and his 3 companions stuck to their orders, living their lives using the survival skills they'd learned in military school. They dug tunnels, covered themselves with leaves, took care of their weapons and uniforms, and stole whatever they needed from nearby farms. In short, they did everything they could to keep their mission going. Life went on like this until October 1945, about 2 months after peace was declared. They suddenly woke up one day to the sound of airplanes in the sky over the forest. They immediately hid in the tunnels they'd built, waiting for bombs to drop, but it was a surprise, they weren't bombs. The planes dropped paper leaflets. Onoda stood up, went, and took one of those papers. Written on it in bold Japanese was, "The war is over. Stop fighting." Of course, everything Onoda and his friend saw was just a desperate trick by the Americans to get them to surrender. To them, it was impossible for the Japanese Empire to lose the war. "You're talking about the Japanese Empire." The soldiers were very proud. It was impossible for them to believe their great country had lost. On top of that, their orders were very clear: surrender is forbidden. So, the situation stayed the same. The group kept going, killing and shooting at anyone they saw, even though the war was over. Onoda was the most stubborn one. He always encouraged his friends and said, "Do you guys really think this is true? It's all lies." The attempts to convince them kept going. Planes came every now and then dropping more leaflets. Some were letters from their relatives, others were newspapers and magazines reporting the surrender, even with photos documenting the events. But the group, led by Onoda, was convinced it was all just a trick. It got to the point where they actually brought their fellow soldiers to speak through loudspeakers in the forest, announcing, "Guys, the war is over. Surrender and come out of your hideouts. There's no more war, it's over." But even that was dismissed as a trick. They said, either these friends of ours are captured and forced to say this, or they are traitors trying to trick us. They kept this up for about 4 years, and because of their patriotism and faith in their country and emperor, their morale was high, but their supplies started to run low. On September 1949, they woke up one day and Akatsu was gone. When they saw his stuff was missing too, they knew he'd turned himself in. Onoda still wasn't ready to give up, but his friend was finally convinced the war was over, especially after noticing that most of the people they saw were civilians. If the war was still on, enemy soldiers should be everywhere, but there were no soldiers, just civilians. Akatsu felt hopeful and told his friends, but Onoda saw him as a traitor. So, Akatsu decided to leave them and surrender instead of killing civilians and farmers for no reason. After Akatsu escaped, things got tense between Onoda and his 2 remaining friends.